I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. As we near the end of 2021, we're also nearing the end of 8 years of Bill de Blasio as mayor, with 4 years at least to come of Eric Adams. The incoming mayor has been in the headlines lately with his trip to Ghana and the cancellation of 10 fundraisers this month. But before Adams becomes the new mayor, let's take a look back at Mayor de Blasio's report card. Did he fulfill the lofty expectations he raised 8 years ago? What were his successes and failures? And during this unprecedented era of COVID, how is the city managed under his and ex-Governor Cuomo's watch? Moving forward, Eric Adams will be sworn in on January 1st. What are the expectations for his mayoralty right off the bat? And what are Adams' large-scale priorities next June, and how to handicap that Democratic mayoral primary for governor in 2022? With the recent news that New York Attorney General Letitia James has dropped out, how will the current governor, Kathy Hochul, fare? And will Mayor de Blasio or any other contenders for that matter challenge Hochul in any meaningful way? We're joined by Jeffrey Mays, Metro political reporter for the New York Times, and Katie Glick, chief Metro political correspondent. Welcome to both of you. And let's take a look. After Bloomberg, what was the promise for Mayor de Blasio? Jeffrey, you've been looking at that for the past couple of years. What did we expect from de Blasio at that point?
Yeah, I think the mayor came in with this idea of that he was going to address what he called the tale of two cities, which was the idea that under Mayor Bloomberg, the city had done very well, but the very wealthy had done very well at the expense of the not so wealthy. So the mayor tapped into that idea, said he wanted to address things like income inequality. His major proposal was universal early childhood care. And so along with addressing what he talked about in terms of policing disparities, racial policing disparities, and the sort of unprecedented use of the stop and frisk program under the Bloomberg administration, which a federal judge found, largely discriminated against Black and Latino men, his promise to end that, those were the issues that helped propel Mayor de Blasio into office.
Katie, you came into this a little bit later. You haven't followed it for the full 8 years, but what did you think? New York has the reputation of being a very liberal city. It elected after Mayor Bloomberg a mayor with a liberal reputation, certainly. Did it live up to those expectations as far as you were concerned?
Well, great to be with you. Certainly the mayoral primary that we saw play out over the last year challenged kind of the question of just how left-wing New York City is. Is the city continuing to be in the really progressive moment that propelled Mayor de Blasio, that propelled other leaders in the Democratic Party like Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, or has there been a move back to the middle? And taking a look at the results of who won the citywide races in November, you can see arguments on kind of both sides of that question. Eric Adams is, relatively speaking, still New York City, of course, unquestionably a very liberal city, but relatively speaking, he is more centrist, especially on issues around how to deal with public safety, how to deal with the business community. At the same time, Brad Lander, the incoming New York City comptroller, is very much kind of at the vanguard of that, what was seen as an ascendant left-wing movement. And so we really do see the potential, broadly speaking, for kind of a continued debate over where the energy in the Democratic Party is moving forward.
Jeffrey, one of the things you pointed out, of course, was the theme of Mayor de Blasio coming in 8 years ago was the tale of two cities, a theme that has echoed for 100 or more years among mayors coming into office in New York. This mayor came in, unlike many other liberal predecessors, flush with money. He came in after the Bloomberg administration. Has he fulfilled that promise at all? He came out with a report just recently on statistics that showed the gap in terms of the poverty rate has narrowed somewhat Those statistics can also often be misleading, although the city's poverty statistics often much more accurate than the federal ones. But it showed a narrowing. Is that accurate? That was pre-COVID, so that may be a little skewed. But did he live up to that promise, do we think?
Well, I think, most people agree that the mayor has made some progress on those issues, even if the numbers are not necessarily showing that income inequality has reduced that greatly. Pre-K, you have 70,000 children now getting early childhood education as young as 3 years old. The mayor, after being pushed a little bit, pushed for the $15 minimum wage, which, maybe help reduce some of that wage gap a little bit, not as much as people promised. But I think what the pandemic showed is that the city is still a city of great inequality. We saw that people who were the poorest were most deeply affected by this coronavirus. You look at places like Elmhurst Hospital, a public hospital that was overwhelmed in Queens, while a few miles away, in Manhattan hospitals, they were not struggling the way they were out in Queens. So I think the mayor has a mixed record on whether he actually made some changes. There were some big changes, but if you're looking at cold hard statistics, income inequality is still a fact of life in New York City.
Katie, what about the mayor as a politician? One of the things that people have said, and maybe this is unfair, and maybe this is the message or the messenger, is that he wasn't a great politician per se, that he squandered an opportunity in a sense that he didn't make people like him, that he could have done a lot more if he had reached deeper into a pool of support that he probably started out with and he may have squandered. What do you think about that?
Well, there's no question that some key parts of Mayor de Blasio's 2013 coalition are just not with him today in the same way. Thinking especially about white, more progressive voters who played a central role in that candidacy. And so you have to take a look at sort of where and how he lost such vital pieces of his coalition. His numbers have historically been better with other slices of his 2013 coalition, and is certainly going forward as he speaks increasingly openly about running for governor. It's clear that he is hoping to rebuild aspects of the coalition that propelled him in 2013. He would obviously start that race in a vastly different position with vastly different challenges. But no question, he came in as this rising star on the left. There were so many people who wanted to see him as a real leader, kind of in the future of the Democratic Party, and certainly he tried to run for president. That did not go so well for him. But unquestionably, there have been challenges politically for him, and he is just in a far weaker position today politically than he was when he came in, which is, of course, going to be a challenge should he, in fact, decide to run statewide.
There are very few mayors who end office in better shape than they began, of course. Jeffrey, he did not run for president very successfully. Now he talks about running for governor. How much of this is a case of doing himself in? The job obviously never does any mayor any good. The spotlight is always on any mayor, probably more than any other office in America. But how much of this was his own undoing, do you think?
Yeah, I think the mayor has had sort of several self-inflicted wounds. I think the problem with him running for president, which I think is understandable. He's the mayor of New York City. When is he ever going to have that platform again? You could see it politically speaking as an opportunity to sort of try to push your ideas on a national level. The problem is that people felt that he wasn't paying enough attention to the city and the very serious problems that we had here. So, meanwhile, while he was out in Iowa, the power went out one summer, for example. While he's in New Hampshire, residents of NYCHA are still dealing with lead in their apartments and a lack of heat in the winter. So, New York had very serious problems, which people were not satisfied that he had addressed fully, given some of the promises Katie talked about, that when he came into office, he was really viewed as this sort of national progressive leader, and he was going to be really progressive on a lot of these issues. A lot of people feel he didn't reach those goals, and then were insulted to see him then try to take some of his successes and take those nationally when there were still so many issues to be dealt with here. There just doesn't seem to be a taste for him to be governor right now, but the mayor said the other day that he's seriously considering running for it.
Katie, New York is never big enough for a mayor and a governor, especially the same party. But how much of the problems in New York, both city and state, are the result of the dueling between Andrew Cuomo and Bill de Blasio? And could they have handled it more constructively for both the city and the state?
If you ask their current and soon-to-be successors, respectively, I think they would tell you certainly there was much more they could have done, Cuomo and de Blasio, to work together on behalf of the city, on behalf of the state. Governor Hochul and Mayor-elect Adams have both made a real point to emphasize that they want to have a far more constructive working relationship than Cuomo and de Blasio did. That the Cuomo-de Blasio relationship was striking for how the degree to which both, there was that real sort of open acrimony between the two of them. It's always a difficult relationship to navigate, but certainly at a moment of real crisis for the city and for the state, there was a lot of frustration with the degree to which those tensions continued to play out, often in quite public view. And so going forward, Adams and Hochul both emphasized that they want a reset and that that's going to be a real priority for both of them in terms of dealing with each other. And there's some mutual self-interest there in having a more productive relationship.
Jeff, when we look back at the mayoralty of Bill de Blasio, how does he think he fared? When you look at certain of the issues like homelessness, which really statistically hasn't gotten much better under any mayor, not just de Blasio. Housing, he talked about affordable housing. We see a lot of statistics, but hasn't really gotten much better. The school system, very hard to gauge. We look at test scores, but hasn't really gotten better. Stop and frisk, the numbers are certainly much better, but crime has also inched up. What does he think he's accomplished, and what does he think he's failed at?
Well, I think, the mayor certainly is right to think that he does have accomplishments. Certainly, even people you speak to who are no fans of Mayor de Blasio's will talk about pre-K as a great success and something that can be built upon further. The mayor has been very honest recently in talking about how he felt he did not address homelessness with the level of urgency that was necessary. And so as a result, we've seen homelessness sort of increase in many ways. The number of families in shelters, especially the number of single adults in shelters as well. But, you have to look back and see that he did inherit a very difficult situation, from the Bloomberg administration. Homelessness was rising. It's honest to see the mayor say that he didn't do enough to address that as quickly as he should have. On other issues, things like stop and frisk, the use has declined dramatically. Unfortunately, the people still being stopped and frisked are largely Black and Latino men, and they're largely innocent. So some people don't see that as a real success. And I would say that is one of the areas where there's strong disagreement. Mayor de Blasio thinks things like neighborhood policing have helped change police community relations, whereas other people see that he has not been nearly as transformational as he promised to be on policing. And that's one of the things that Eric Adams has used to his advantage to talk to the electorate as a former police officer, that he understands the need for both safety, but also not violating people's civil rights. It's a difficult tightrope that he's promised to walk, and it's going to be one of the biggest issues that Eric Adams is going to be judged on.
Katie, before we look ahead at Eric Adams, looking at Andrew Cuomo, how will history judge his record as governor, and does he have a political future, do you think?
Both great questions, and certainly the latter is something that has preoccupied many people in Albany and in New York political circles this fall. There's a variety of opinions, of course, in New York about how to judge Andrew Cuomo's legacy. Certainly some of that. Some of his record in terms of combating the pandemic has already come under significant scrutiny over the last year as we take a look at what ended up in fact happening on nursing homes, for example. There are certainly many New Yorkers who tend to say, we like many things that he accomplished, but don't like his behavior, don't like the conduct that came out in the reports that have come out over the last year. And then there's certainly many other people who have long had disagreements with him and believe that the additional scrutiny that he's faced as he is faced growing investigations and of course ultimately resigned, that was in fact a long time coming. To the question of whether he has a political future, that is something that I think a lot of people in New York circles think about, talk about. He certainly did not want to leave under these circumstances. He's long had a focus on the governorship and someone who thinks a lot about his legacy. And so it's something that is discussed quite often. We haven't seen him necessarily make a move on that front yet, but he had signaled that should Tish James, the Attorney General, continue with the run for governor, he was going to try and he had suggested that he was going to try and shape that race. He's of course very upset about the report that she issued that led to his resignation. So I guess the answer to that is people will continue to be keeping a close eye on that front.
That's a good guess, I'd say. Jeff, what are the expectations for Eric Adams? Certainly it's going to be a breath of fresh air compared to what we've seen personally and professionally in terms of Mayor de Blasio. But what do you think will be different in a Eric Adams administration? We've also seen two major appointments, at least in terms of the schools chancellor, in terms of the police commissioner, things that already signal a major difference in his administration.
Yeah, I think, there's going to be a different personality in City Hall, to be honest. Eric Adams is very gregarious, outgoing.
A lot more fun.
Yeah, yes. He goes out, he likes nightlife. One of the knocks against Mayor de Blasio is that he often didn't seem to enjoy the job of being mayor, which will allow you to do things like sit in the stands at Yankee stadiums or go to Knicks games and go to the Met Opera and the Met Gala, those sort of things. He didn't seem to necessarily enjoy. But Eric Adams, I don't think that's going to be a problem with him. We've already seen that he likes nightlife. He likes to go to Cipriani's and other clubs and restaurants and bars. But I think realistically speaking, he is facing a very difficult situation. We have concerns about crime in the city as right now. In addition, the financial picture is not looking great. Mayor de Blasio came in, was flush with cash. That is not going to be Eric Adams' situation. Once we see some of these federal pandemic monies start to dwindle, and the city's going to have to figure out a way to shore up its tax base. How do we get people back in offices? How do we get the economy going? How do we reduce the unemployment, which is higher here than in the rest of the country? So yeah, I think, he has expressed having a ton of energy to address those difficult challenges, but certainly is not going to be an easy road for him ahead initially.
I like the way he's starting out with his inauguration at the Lowe's Kings, which incidentally is where I had my high school graduation. So I feel a certain affinity right there. Katie, how will we measure how well Eric Adams is doing? You always have to figure out how to do that. Do you measure against a candidate's promises, against our own expectations, against what he has to deal with coming in? How 4 years from now or whenever will we be able to judge whether Eric Adams has been successful as a mayor or not?
Certainly, as Jeff laid out, Eric Adams faces, an extraordinary array of challenges as he takes office. I think to some degree you have to hold him accountable to his central campaign promise, which was that public safety and justice, as he has said, are the prerequisites to prosperity. He ran a campaign, certainly in the primary, as well as in the general election, really tightly focused on the issue of public safety, and who's used that as a lens to talk about a whole range of other challenges facing the city, including, of course, the economy. How do you bring back Midtown? How do you get people back to offices? How do you address issues of unemployment? For him, as he has framed it, this all runs through this question of public safety. And but by sort of his own metrics, that seems to be one area where it's going to be really fair to evaluate, where are the shooting numbers, where are other crime numbers, all across the city, and what steps did he have to take to bring those down if in fact he's successful. And certainly he has proposed a number of efforts on that front that suggested that they may face some controversy, may face some pushback. He's really interesting on this question of public safety. He is, of course, a longtime police officer who also fought for reforms from within the system. And so does he bring kind of that background into the mayorship? And if so, what does that look like? How does he strike that balance? And then certainly more broadly, similar in some ways to Mayor de Blasio, Eric Adams is coming into office as a national figure, certainly from a very different political wing of the Democratic Party in some ways, at least. But he's really been celebrated nationally as kind of the model in the eyes of at least some national Democrats, including at the House Democratic Campaign Committee, the model for how you talk about balancing combating crime with ensuring that, as Jeff was talking about, people's civil rights, civil liberties are not infringed upon. And so he comes in with a lot of attention on him. There's always a spotlight on the mayor of New York City, but headed into a difficult midterm election for the Democrats, he's someone who's really caught a lot of people's attention. And does he live up to that?
We've come a long way, Jeffrey, since David Dinkins was sworn in as the city's first Black mayor. How big a role, not so much in the election, but in terms of the mayoralty, is race likely to play in Eric Adams' mayoralty? It seems to be I wouldn't say anything like a post-racial political situation by any means, and we have no idea how it's going to play out, but it seems very, very different from what it was as a historical first with David Dinkins.
Yeah, look, it's a different time. See some similarities, unfortunately, where, they are both, David Dinkins and Mayor Adams are inheriting the city at a very difficult time. I think Eric Adams really built his campaign on the idea that he understood, working class, poor, Black, brown, Latino people. That's really the base of his coalition. As you mentioned, he's going to have his inauguration out in Brooklyn, which is another symbol that he is not going to be a Manhattan centered mayor. At least he says he's not going to be. And I think in his appointments already, his first two appointments have been African Americans, David Banks, the school's chancellor, and Chief Sewell, who is going to be the first Black woman police commissioner. So certainly, he's going to look to have a very diverse administration. I think he can speak to certain issues regarding race in a way that Mayor de Blasio just couldn't. As a Black man who was in the police department, who was abused by police as a young man, he certainly just has a wealth of life experience that he's going to use in different situations. Even when he's facing certain criticism, he's going to be able to use his certain personal experience to sort of stave off some of that criticism, and even just buy him more time and people willing to give him a chance on certain issues. So definitely not post-racial, but definitely he's going to have to please that base that he put together if he expects to be successful.
And also, Katie, he seems to, although he's had a little trouble dealing with the city council already in terms of the speakership, he seems to be a fairly deft politician. Is that right, would you say?
Absolutely. Very deft politician. A lot of political observers were struck at how message disciplined his campaign was during the primary. He has managed to put together a really interesting coalition, and everyone, a very wide-ranging coalition that certainly includes some Republicans rooting for his success as well. And if I could add one more thing to your earlier question about how we should judge Mayor-elect Adams's tenure as mayor, I think Jeff brings up such a good point about how about the extent to which he has rooted his future mayoralty in support of the outer boroughs, in support, really focused on the experiences of middle and working class people of color from around the city, not just Manhattan. And so, I think the question of recovery from the pandemic, to what extent is that an equitable recovery? That's something he's talked about quite a bit, and is something he's going to be very deeply focused on, really at every level, or so he said. And so that's going to be an important metric too.
And I think, as Jeffrey has written, he's also reached out to a lot more people. His inner circle is a lot bigger than Bill de Blasio's has been. Thanks to Jeffrey Mayes, Katie Glick of the New York Times. And for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.